Let's face it, most fancy foods are less about taste and more about showing off. Sometimes, though, a plate's high price tag is well earned. Whether it's down to the rarest ingredients or the most remarkable flavors, these are the most expensive foods you need to try before you die. Potatoes aren't usually considered much of a luxury food, but these little yellow spuds from the small French island of Noirmoutier are easily the most expensive in the world. La Bonne potatoes can only grow in the island's mineral-rich coastal soil, and they're so fragile that they have to be carefully cultivated and harvested by hand during a brief period of peak ripeness in the early days of May. The main appeal behind these potatoes is their distinctly salty flavor, which is said to pair especially well with another of the world's most expensive foods, caviar. La Bonne potatoes are sold for as little as $45 per pound when they're in season, but the harvesting season is only about a week long. The best of the harvest is often sold at the Paris auction house Drouot, where it can reach prices as high as $300 a pound. In everyday terms, that means that a large serving of McDonald's French fries made with these potatoes would set you back about $18 at a good time of year, and up to $115 if they're out of season.
Worth it.
Spain is well known for the exceptional quality of its ham, and the best by far is jamón ibérico. This ham comes from the meat of black Iberian pigs, which is dried for weeks and aged for months after slaughter. It's finally served in paper-thin slices that are made to melt on the tongue. And the very best of the best is the jamón ibérico made from pigs raised solely on a diet of acorns. The pigs themselves live a relaxed but active life, much of which is spent fattening themselves up by devouring around 15 pounds of acorns every day. The result is a rich meat with a sweet, nutty flavor, streaked with delicious fat that's almost as rich in oleic acid as extra virgin olive oil. Of course, the bad news is that a leg of jamón ibérico can set you back $1,200 or more, so even a taste of this extraordinary ham will put a serious dent in your wallet. Not even the world's best cheeses are going to set you back more than $50 a pound, unless there's something about them that makes them exceptionally scarce. But that's the case for Pule, a crumbly smoked white cheese from Serbia, which has sold for as much as several $100s per pound. This is because Pule cheese is made from the milk of the Balkan donkey, an endangered species. It also takes several gallons of milk to make just 1 pound of this cheese. Pule found fame in 2012 when someone started a rumor that Serbian tennis star Novak Djokovic had bought up the world's entire supply of the stuff. Obviously, it wasn't true in the slightest, but it made for a good headline. It was good news for the donkeys, too, as sales of the cheese support the donkey sanctuary in Zasavica in its efforts to become self-sustaining. And sure, Pule might be a little more expensive than its modest flavor demands, but knowing that you're helping these desperately endangered donkeys should leave a pleasant taste in your mouth. Cantaloupe melons are usually pretty easy to find, and you'd never really expect to pay more than a few dollars for one. But one cultivar of cantaloupe also happens to be the most expensive fruit in the world. It's called the Yubari King, and in 2016, a pair of them sold at auction for $27,000. Grown in greenhouses in the city of Yubari in the Hokkaido region of Japan, these melons reach higher prices the more perfectly round and unblemished they are, because they hold great value as gifts in Japanese culture. But these melons aren't just status symbols. They're also prized for their juicy flesh and sweet floral flavor. An individual melon from a Japanese department store can go for anything between $50 and $100. But if you just want a sample, you might be able to pick up a single slice for a few dollars from a street vendor in Yubari itself. Japanese Kobe beef became a hot food trend a few years ago, as people suddenly became aware of a whole new category of delicate, well-marbled steaks they hadn't seen before. As such, for a long time it seemed that every gastropub in America featured Kobe sliders or Kobe brisket on its menu. Yet real Kobe was almost impossible to find outside Japan, and at more than $300 a pound, the real stuff would be wasted on a burger, too. Kobe beef comes from a strictly controlled strain of Japanese Wagyu cattle raised in the Kobe region of Japan. In 2016, only 9 restaurants in the U.S. were licensed to sell it. And like Kobe, the term Wagyu has been degraded by overuse and branding. It often refers to the product of crossbreeding between Wagyu cattle and other breeds. The term full-blood, however, is a sign that your steak comes from pure Wagyu cattle stock. And although the cattle might have been reared anywhere in the world, the beef should still hold all that intense, mouth-watering flavor that makes Wagyu so irresistible. Just don't turn it into a meatball or something. Many restaurants like to make headlines by offering absurdly expensive dishes like lobster frittatas or truffle-topped Kobe burgers, and most of them seem more like novel ways to run up an expense account than the best use of luxury ingredients. But an exception might be made for the quintessential grilled cheese sandwich at New York's Serendipity 3, a lavish take on everyone's favorite comfort food. At $214, it's been called the world's most expensive sandwich, and given the ingredients, it might also be one of the world's tastiest. In fact, the ingredients are so rare that the quintessential grilled cheese has to be ordered at least 2 days in advance to make sure everything can be properly sourced. The sandwich is made using bread baked with Dom Perignon champagne, butter infused with white truffles, and 18-month aged cheese from the milk of rare Podolica cows. These cows graze on the rocky terrain of Italy's Basilicata Mountains, and their milk creates a sweet, herby cheese that intensifies as it ages. Of course, every great grilled cheese comes with a bowl of tomato soup, and this one is served with a bisque made from South African lobsters and sweet San Marzano tomatoes. The sandwich also contains 24-karat edible gold and is served on Baccarat crystal, which in fairness does seem a little excessive. But even if you skipped those elements and brown bagged it, you'd still come out of Serendipity 3 with a darn good grilled cheese. And that's what really matters, isn't it?
It's hard, salty, and it's got great bite. Almost like a piece of Parmesan, but better.
Much better, much better.
South Australia's Coffin Bay Oyster Farm describes its complex, flavorful king oysters as the oyster steaks of the ocean. But what makes these oysters truly remarkable is their size. A single Coffin Bay king oyster in its shell can weigh as much as 2 pounds and can cost the equivalent of $75 in U.S. currency. Coffin Bay king oysters are so large and expensive because they're allowed to grow for up to 6 years. They have a lot more meat than a typical oyster, so some chewing is required, and the scale of them may be more than some diners can stomach. But if you're a fan of oysters, they're a must-try. The bad news is that you'll have to make your way down to Australia's Eyre Peninsula, where these giants are sold exclusively at a local restaurant called Saren's. The good news, however, is that you get to keep the oyster shell as a souvenir. Naturally, a fancy feast needs rounding off with a fancy digestif, and one of the world's priciest has got to be Balvenie 50-year-old Scotch whiskey, which sells for upward of $35,000 a bottle. Sadly, most people are unlikely to ever see a bottle of Balvenie in their lifetimes, let alone afford to buy one. Luckily, there are other options out there. Slightly more affordable is Pappy Van Winkle, a small-batch Kentucky bourbon that boasts notes of maple, fudge, oak, and spice, and sells for up to $75 for a single shot. In October 2013, around 200 bottles of Pappy Van Winkle were stolen from the company's distillery. 9 arrests were eventually made, but the few bottles that were recovered were marked for destruction for fear of contamination. The Pappy Van Winkle bourbon robbery is only one example of the mania that surrounds this bourbon too, with fans typically snapping up most of each year's batch before the bottles even reach stores. Everyone loves a bargain pizza, and that can sometimes make it hard to justify splashing the cash on something costlier. But there is one pricey pizza out there that's more than worth the price tag.
Pizza time.
This is the Steveson Pizza Company's C6, which retails at a whopping $850. According to chef Nader Hatami, this 12-inch 10-slice pizza feeds around 5 people, and if you're a true lover of all things seafood, it's an absolute must-have. The pizza is piled high with tiger prawns, smoked steelhead, Osetra caviar, and lobster ratatouille, and finished off with Italian white truffles. But you can't just show up and order this bad boy off the menu. You'll have to give them a day's notice first. If that all sounds like too much of a fuss, however, you could always opt for the Storm Pizza, which is topped with shrimp, crab legs, lobster, and salmon. And at just $100, it's a downright bargain, too, relatively speaking. Balsamic vinegar is one of those kitchen staples that most people don't give a second thought to. But there is one particular kind that everyone should try at least once, the traditional balsamic vinegar made in Modena, Italy. The families in this region have had plenty of time to perfect their method. The tradition dates back to the 11th century when it was willed to future generations and passed along in wedding dowries. Even today, while one generation grows and harvests the grapes, another generation finishes the process and bottles the vinegar, which is aged for up to 25 years. Every family has their own recipe and conditions for aging, and each product tastes very different. The whole process has been likened to winemaking, which also explains why each bottle can cost upwards of several $100s. It's more than worth it, though, if only for the chance to sample a taste of a centuries-long culinary legacy. You've probably heard of Wagyu and Kobe beef, but these aren't the only hyper-expensive types of beef out there. Take blonde Aquitaine beef, for example, which is made from cows that are raised and slaughtered by a single butcher on a single family farm in France. Alexandre Polmard is the sixth-generation butcher of the family business, which was founded in 1846. The family weren't always putting out such high-end meats, though, and things only really kicked off in the 1990s when they developed a new way of treating their meat. Known as hibernation, this process involves storing the meat in a cold and windy environment. Reportedly, doing this allows the meat to be stored for any amount of time with no impact on the product itself. The cows are also hand-reared, live in the forests and grasslands of France, and are slaughtered in a $1 million facility designed to make the process as stress-free as possible. And the end result of all this? A cut of the world's most expensive beef, which can sell for up to $3,200 per steak.